The heart-wrenching sobs that escaped Rachel Zimmerman's lips were drowned out by the piercing whistle of the approaching train, her trembling hands clutching the small valise that contained all that remained of her former life. At 6 months pregnant, her swollen belly pressed uncomfortably against the tight confines of her once-fitting dress, and the cruel June sun of 1876 beat down mercilessly upon Florissant, Colorado's modest train platform. Rachel wiped away her tears with a handkerchief, already damp from previous attempts. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been a happily married woman with dreams of raising her child in the small Colorado mining town where her husband Thomas had secured work. Now she was a widow, her husband's body laid to rest after a mining collapse that had claimed not only his life, but those of 11 other men. "Final boarding for eastbound train to Denver," the station master called out, his voice carrying across the platform. Rachel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. She had no family left in Florissant, no friends close enough to depend upon. The little money Thomas had saved wouldn't last long, but her sister in St. Louis had written offering shelter until she could find her footing again. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. As she stepped forward to board, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and stumble. Her valise tumbled to the wooden planks of the platform as she grasped for support. Finding none, she began to fall. But the impact never came. Strong arms caught her, and she looked up into the face of a stranger, a tall man with kind eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hat shaded features that were weathered but handsome, stubble lining a strong jaw. "Whoa there, madam," he said, his voice deep and gentle. He steadied her with careful hands before retrieving her fallen bag. Rachel noticed his worn leather chaps and the dusty boots that marked him as a working cowboy. He tipped his hat politely after ensuring she was stable on her feet. "You're not alone anymore." Rachel's eyes widened with surprise. "Thank you, sir, but I don't wish to trouble you. The train—" "Xavier Thornton," he interrupted, introducing himself while keeping a respectful distance. "And no trouble at all. Though if you don't mind my saying, you look like you could use a friend right about now." Rachel hesitated, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. "Rachel Zimmerman," she replied cautiously, "and I'm afraid I have a train to catch." Xavier glanced at the train, then back to Rachel's pale face. "Mrs. Zimmerman, forgive my boldness, but you don't look well enough for travel. Is there someone meeting you? Someone traveling with you?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. "No," she whispered, tears threatening again. "There's no one. Not anymore." Xavier's expression softened further. "Then perhaps you might consider postponing your journey, at least until you're feeling stronger." He gestured toward a bench in the shade. "I'd be happy to fetch the doctor. Dr. Ferguson's office is just across the street." Rachel wavered, torn between the desperate need to flee this place of painful memories and the undeniable reality of her condition. Another sharp pain decided for her, and she nodded gratefully, allowing Xavier to guide her to the bench. "The train," she protested weakly as it began to pull away from the station. "There'll be another," Xavier assured her. "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it." He flagged down a young boy loitering nearby. "Tommy, run and fetch Dr. Ferguson. Tell him there's a lady in need at the station." As the boy dashed off, Xavier took a seat at a respectful distance. "May I ask where you were headed?" "St. Louis," Rachel replied. "My sister lives there." She studied him more carefully now. Despite his rugged appearance, there was something gentle in his manner. His dark hair curled slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt, and though he was clearly trail-worn, there was a cleanliness and dignity about him that spoke of self-respect. "That's a long journey for anyone," Xavier observed, "especially in your condition." Rachel stiffened. "I have little choice, Mr. Thornton. My husband died 2 weeks ago in the mine collapse. I have no income, no home to return to, and—" she gestured to her belly. "A child to think of." Xavier's expression darkened with sympathy. "I heard about that terrible accident. I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman. Truly I am." Before Rachel could respond, Dr. Ferguson arrived, medical bag in hand. He was an older man with spectacles and a kind, weathered face. "Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, approaching them. "I'm Dr. Ferguson. This young man says you're experiencing some distress." Rachel nodded, explaining the sudden pains. The doctor listened attentively, then performed a brief examination right there on the bench, maintaining her dignity with a blanket he pulled from his bag. "Nothing too concerning," he finally pronounced, "but you are showing signs of exhaustion and stress, which isn't surprising given your circumstances. Travel now would be ill-advised. You need rest, good food, and calm for at least a few days." Rachel's face fell. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I have nowhere to stay. The boarding house where Thomas and I lived. I've already given up our room." Xavier, who had moved away during the examination, stepped forward. "If I may," he said, "Mrs. Sullivan at the Silver Creek boarding house always has a room or two available. It's clean, respectable, and she's known for her home cooking." Dr. Ferguson nodded approvingly. "Margaret Sullivan is a fine woman. Her place would be perfect for a few days' recovery." "But Rachel began, her voice faltering. Understanding her unspoken concern, Xavier tipped his hat. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I work for the Diamond Tea Ranch just outside town. If you're worried about the cost, we're always looking for someone to help with the books and correspondence. The owner, Mr. Henderson, is getting on in years and his eyesight isn't what it used to be. I'd be happy to speak with him about offering you some light work that wouldn't strain your condition." Rachel looked at him with surprise and suspicion. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Xavier's weathered face softened. "Madam, my mother found herself in a similar position once. A stranger's kindness made all the difference to us. I'm just passing it along, that's all." Something in his straightforward manner and clear gaze reassured Rachel. After a moment's consideration, she nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Thornton. I accept your help, at least until I'm well enough to travel." Dr. Ferguson smiled. "Excellent decision. Now, let's get you settled at Mrs. Sullivan's. I'll stop by tomorrow to check on you." Xavier picked up Rachel's valise in one hand and offered his other arm for support. As they walked slowly toward the Silver Creek boarding house, Rachel found herself wondering at the strange turn her day had taken. She had boarded the morning stagecoach to Florissant's train station, believing she was leaving Colorado forever, alone and frightened. Now, as the afternoon sun bathed the small town in golden light, she found herself staying, at least temporarily, with the unexpected support of a kind stranger. What she couldn't possibly know then was how completely Xavier Thornton's simple act of compassion would change the course of her life. Mrs. Sullivan proved to be everything Xavier had promised a motherly woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense manner and a generous heart. She took one look at Rachel's pale face and swollen ankles and immediately ushered her to a clean, airy room on the first floor. "No stairs for you, my dear," she declared, fluffing pillows and sending Xavier to fetch fresh water. "And you'll take supper in here tonight. Tomorrow, if you're feeling stronger, you can join the other boarders at the table." Rachel sank gratefully onto the comfortable bed. "You're very kind, Mrs. Sullivan. I can pay for 3 days' lodging, but beyond that, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Mrs. Sullivan interrupted gently. "Mr. Thornton says you might be helping out at Diamond Tea for a spell, and they're good folks who always pay their debts. Now, you rest while I fix you some tea." When they were alone, Rachel turned to Xavier, who stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been at the station today." Xavier nodded, a slight smile softening his features. "Just doing what any decent fellow would do, Mrs. Zimmerman. I'll speak with Mr. Henderson tomorrow about the bookkeeping position. In the meantime, rest easy. Florissant's a small town, but good people live here." After he left, Rachel allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in weeks. The grief of losing Thomas still ached like an open wound, but the immediate panic of being alone and with child in a difficult world had eased somewhat. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the baby move within, "We're going to be all right," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as her unborn child. "We just need a little time." The next morning, Rachel awoke feeling considerably better. Mrs. Sullivan brought her a hearty breakfast and helped her into a clean dress that accommodated her pregnancy more comfortably than her traveling clothes. "One of my previous boarders left it behind," Mrs. Sullivan explained. "She had her baby here last year before moving on to California with her husband. It's yours if you want it." Rachel gratefully accepted, and by mid-morning, she felt strong enough to sit in the parlor. The boarding house was quiet during the day, most residents being out at their various occupations. She was just wondering how to send word to her sister in St. Louis when a knock at the door heralded Xavier's return. He looked different today, cleaner, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a fresh shirt under his leather vest. He carried his hat in his hands and appeared almost nervous as Mrs. Sullivan showed him into the parlor. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said with a polite nod, "I'm glad to see you looking better today." "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. I feel much improved after a good night's rest." Xavier took a seat when invited, perching somewhat awkwardly on the edge of an armchair. "I spoke with Mr. Henderson this morning about the bookkeeping position. He's willing to meet with you this afternoon if you feel up to it." Rachel straightened. "Yes, of course. I'm quite experienced with accounts. My father was a banker in Pennsylvania, and he taught me his methods." Something like admiration flickered in Xavier's gray eyes. "That's fortunate. Mr. Henderson's been making do with his own system for years, but it's more memory than method these days. The ranch has grown, and the old ways aren't keeping up." "And what exactly is the Diamond Tea Ranch?" Rachel asked. "We run cattle mostly, about 2,000 head, plus some horses. It's a good-sized spread about 5 miles outside of town. Mr. Henderson, Jack Henderson, started it 30 years ago with just 20 acres and 10 head of cattle. Now it's one of the largest operations in this part of Colorado." "And you're a cowhand there?" Xavier's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Foreman, actually. Been with the Diamond Tea for 8 years now." Rachel tried to hide her surprise. He seemed young for such responsibility, perhaps 30 at most, but there was a steady capability about him that made it believable. "If you're feeling strong enough," Xavier continued, "I thought we might ride out to the ranch after lunch. The buggy ride isn't too rough, and Mr. Henderson prefers to conduct business at home these days. His joints give him trouble in damp weather." Rachel hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I would appreciate that, and I should send a telegram to my sister in St. Louis to let her know my plans have changed." "We can stop at the telegraph office on our way," Xavier agreed. True to his word, Xavier returned after lunch with a well-maintained buggy and a gentle mare to pull it. He'd added a cushion to the seat and helped Rachel climb up with careful attention to her condition. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Rachel sent a brief message explaining her delayed travel and promising to write soon with more details. As they left town, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with pines and aspens, the distant mountains forming a majestic backdrop. The June day was warm but pleasant, a light breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage. "It's beautiful country," Rachel observed, inhaling deeply. Xavier nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon with obvious affection. "Colorado gets in your blood. I came out here from Texas when I was 20, looking for something different. Never could bring myself to leave." "What about your family? Are they still in Texas?" A shadow passed over his features. "My parents are gone now. Pa died when I was 12, kicked by a horse he was shoeing. Ma held on until I was 19, but her heart was never strong." He glanced at her. "I have a younger sister, Abigail, married to a shopkeeper in Denver. They're doing well." Rachel felt a pang of empathy. "I'm sorry about your parents. I lost mine in a smallpox outbreak 5 years ago. My sister Charlotte is my only family now." She paused, one hand moving unconsciously to her belly. At least, she was. Xavier's gaze followed her movement. "How long until—" "About 3 months," Rachel replied. "The baby is due in September." They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested a hill, Xavier pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance, nestled in a verdant valley with a creek winding through it. Diamond Tea, he said with unmistakable pride. Mr. Henderson named it for his late wife, Theodora, said she was as precious as a diamond and twice as strong. The ranch was impressive, a large main house built of sturdy logs and stone, several outbuildings including a bunkhouse, barn, and corrals. Men were visible working with horses in one of the fenced areas, while smoke rose lazily from the chimney of what appeared to be a cookhouse. Xavier guided the buggy directly to the main house and helped Rachel down with gentle hands. He led her up to a wide porch, where an elderly man sat in a rocking chair, his gnarled hands resting on a walking stick. "Mr. Henderson," Xavier called respectfully, "this is Mrs. Rachel Zimmerman, the lady I mentioned this morning." Jack Henderson was in his 70s, with a full head of white hair and sharp blue eyes that belied his age. He struggled to his feet, waving away Xavier's attempt to help. "I ain't dead yet, boy," he growled, though there was affection in his tone. He turned his piercing gaze to Rachel. "Mrs. Zimmerman, Xavier tells me you've had a rough time of it lately. Sorry about your husband. The mines are dangerous work." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Rachel replied, "and thank you for considering me for the bookkeeping position." Henderson gestured toward the door. "Come inside. We can talk business where it's cooler." The interior of the house was surprisingly refined for a bachelor rancher, good furniture, polished floors, and framed paintings on the walls. Rachel noticed a portrait of a handsome woman above the fireplace, presumably the Theodora for whom the ranch was named. Henderson caught her looking. "My Teddy," he said, his gruff voice softening. "Been gone 20 years now, but I still talk to her portrait every night." He led them into a study cluttered with papers and ledgers. "This is where the real mess is. Been trying to keep up with it myself, but my eyes ain't what they used to be, and numbers were never my strong suit anyway." Rachel surveyed the chaos with a practiced eye. "May I?" she asked, indicating one of the open ledgers. Henderson nodded, and she began to review the entries, quickly discerning the system flawed as it was that the rancher had been using. "I believe I can help organize this," she said after several minutes. "You've been tracking the essentials, but a more systematic approach would make it easier to see the ranch's overall financial health at a glance." Henderson's bushy eyebrows rose. "You got all that from 5 minutes with my chicken scratches?" Rachel smiled, her first genuine smile in weeks. "As I told Mr. Thornton, my father was a banker. He insisted I learn double-entry bookkeeping before I learned embroidery." Henderson barked a laugh. "Sounds like a practical man." He eased himself into a chair behind the desk. "Here's what I'm offering. Room and board, plus $20 a month. You can stay in the old foreman's cabin." Xavier moved to the bunkhouse years ago when he took over, said the privacy wasn't worth the isolation. "It's small but clean, has its own water pump, and it's close enough to the main house that help is nearby if you need it." He paused, glancing at her condition. "When your time comes, we'll make sure you have proper care." Rachel hesitated. It was a generous offer, especially to a woman in her circumstances. "Mr. Henderson, that's very kind, but I wouldn't want charity." "Ain't charity if you're earning it," Henderson retorted. "This mess," he waved at the papers, "needs sorting something fierce. And come fall, you'll have your hands full with a little one. We can adjust your duties then. Maybe you could help with correspondence, too. My letters to suppliers tend to be on the short and profane side, which ain't always good for business." Rachel couldn't help laughing at his candor. She glanced at Xavier, who had remained quietly by the door. "The cabin's solid," he offered. "I can have it aired out and ready by tomorrow if you decide to accept." Rachel considered her options. The position offered security during a vulnerable time, and the isolated location would give her space to grieve and prepare for motherhood. St. Louis and her sister would still be there in a few months if she decided this arrangement wasn't working. "I accept your offer, Mr. Henderson," she said finally, "and I appreciate the opportunity." Henderson's weathered face broke into a smile. "Good. Xavier, show Mrs. Zimmerman around, then take her back to town to collect her things. She can start tomorrow if she's feeling up to it." As Xavier led Rachel back outside, she took a deep breath of the clean mountain air. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a small spark of hope for the future. She hadn't planned on staying in Florissant, but perhaps this unexpected detour was exactly what she needed. Over the next few days, Rachel settled into a rhythm at Diamond T Ranch. The foreman's cabin, though small, was clean and snug, with a bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a sitting area. Xavier had added thoughtful touches: wildflowers in a jar on the table, extra blankets for cooler nights, and a comfortable chair positioned by the window where the afternoon light was best for reading or sewing. Each morning, Rachel walked the short distance to the main house, where she spent several hours organizing Henderson's chaotic accounts. The work was satisfying, giving her mind something to focus on besides grief and worry. Henderson proved to be a gruff but kind employer, insisting she take breaks and often sending one of the ranch hands with snacks. Mrs. Potter, the cook, prepared specifically for the mother-to-be. Xavier kept a respectful distance, but his quiet presence was a constant. He would appear with a fresh pitcher of water on hot afternoons, or offer to escort her on short walks around the ranch property to stretch her legs when she'd been sitting too long. Sometimes they talked about the ranch, about books they'd read, about the changing seasons in Colorado, and sometimes they walked in comfortable silence. Rachel found herself looking forward to these moments. Xavier never mentioned Thomas or asked prying questions about her past, allowing her the space to mention her late husband when she felt able. And slowly, Rachel began to heal. One evening in early July, about 3 weeks after her arrival at Diamond T, Rachel sat on the small porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The day had been warm, but the evening brought a cool breeze that rustled through the aspens surrounding the clearing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention, and she saw Xavier riding toward her cabin. He dismounted smoothly, tipping his hat as he approached. "Evening, Mrs. Zimmerman. Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Thornton. Would you care to join me? The sunset is particularly beautiful tonight." Xavier nodded, securing his horse to the porch rail, before settling into the second chair Rachel had placed on her small porch. For a while, they simply watched the sky's changing canvas in companionable silence. "Mr. Henderson is pleased with your work," Xavier said eventually. "Says the books haven't been this organized since Mrs. Henderson was alive." Rachel smiled, pleased by the compliment. "He's a good man beneath all that gruffness. Rather like someone else I know," she added with a sideways glance. Xavier chuckled, the sound warm in the evening air. "Don't let the boys hear you say that. I have a reputation to maintain." "Your secret is safe with me," Rachel assured him. She shifted slightly, placing a hand on her growing belly as the baby kicked. Without thinking, she murmured, "Someone's feeling lively tonight." Xavier's eyes widened with interest. "May I?" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his own impulse. Rachel surprised herself by nodding. It was forward, perhaps even improper, but there was something so genuinely curious in his expression that formality seemed unnecessary. She took his weathered hand and placed it gently on the side of her belly where the movement was strongest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the baby kicked again, a strong movement that was clearly felt beneath Xavier's palm. His face transformed with wonder, a boyish smile breaking through his usual reserve. "That's amazing," he breathed, quickly withdrawing his hand as if suddenly remembering himself. "Sorry if that was too familiar." "It's all right," Rachel said softly. "It's nice to share it with someone. Sometimes it gets lonely, experiencing all of this without your husband," Xavier finished gently when her voice trailed off. Rachel nodded, tears suddenly threatening. "Thomas was so excited about becoming a father. He used to talk to the baby every night." She wiped at her eyes. "I'm sorry. You didn't come here to listen to me weep." "Actually," Xavier said, reaching into his pocket, "I brought you something." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much, but I thought it might be useful." Rachel opened it carefully to find a beautifully carved wooden rattle, the handle smooth and polished, the ball at the end containing something that made a soft, pleasant sound when shaken. Xavier, she breathed, forgetting formality in her surprise. Did you make this? He nodded, a touch of color rising to his tanned cheeks. Whittling helps pass the time on night watches. I noticed you've been gathering things for the baby, and I thought, well, every baby needs a rattle. Rachel ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It's beautiful. Thank you. Their eyes met in the fading light, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the friendship that had been steadily growing. For the first time since Thomas's death, Rachel felt a flutter in her heart that had nothing to do with grief. The moment was broken by the dinner bell ringing at the cookhouse. I should go, Xavier said, rising. Will you join us for supper? Mrs. Potter mentioned she's making her famous apple pie tonight. Rachel shook her head. Thank you, but I have some bread and cheese here. I'm feeling a bit tired this evening. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then I'll bid you good night, Mrs. Zimmerman. Rest well. As he rode back toward the main part of the ranch, Rachel remained on the porch, the carved rattle cradled in her hands, wondering at the strange turns life could take and the unexpected forms comfort might assume. July passed into August, and Rachel's pregnancy progressed. Dr. Ferguson rode out to Diamond T every week to check on her, always pronouncing her healthy as a horse, though considerably prettier. The baby grew active, especially in the evenings, and Rachel found herself talking aloud to her unborn child, sharing the events of her day and her thoughts about the future. Her relationship with Xavier continued to develop in small, meaningful ways. He began bringing her books from his own modest collection tales of adventure and exploration that transported her beyond the confines of her pregnancy and the ranch. Sometimes he would stop by in the evenings, and they would discuss what she was reading or share stories from their pasts. Rachel learned that Xavier had taught himself to read as a young man, devouring any printed material he could find. He spoke French, picked up from Cajun cowboys in Texas, and had a surprising knowledge of Shakespeare, courtesy of a former schoolteacher who'd worked as a cook on a cattle drive years ago. In turn, Rachel shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's banking business, and her courtship with Thomas. It grew easier to speak of her late husband as the weeks passed, remembering the good times without being overwhelmed by loss. One warm August evening, Xavier invited her to ride out to a special spot on the ranch property. It's not far, he assured her, and the buggy ride is smooth. There's something I'd like to show you before summer ends. Curious, Rachel agreed. Xavier arrived at her cabin just before sunset, driving the same comfortable buggy he'd used that first day. He had added extra cushions and brought along a light blanket in case the evening turns cool. He guided the horse along a well-maintained trail that wound through a stand of pines before emerging into a hidden meadow. Rachel gasped at the sight. The entire clearing was ablaze with wildflowers, their colors vivid in the golden evening light. A small stream meandered through the middle, its water catching the sunset's glow. It's beautiful, she breathed as Xavier helped her down from the buggy. Mrs. Henderson planted some of these flowers decades ago, Xavier explained, leading her to a fallen log that served as a natural bench. They've spread over the years. Mr. Henderson won't allow cattle to graze here, says it's Teddy's garden and always will be. They sat together, watching as fireflies began to rise from the grass, their tiny lights dancing among the flowers. The peaceful beauty of the moment wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. I wanted you to see this place, Xavier said quietly, because it reminds me that beauty can persist even after great loss. Mrs. Henderson has been gone for decades, but her flowers still bloom every summer. Rachel understood what he was trying to say. Life continues, she murmured, different perhaps than what was planned, but still containing moments of unexpected joy. Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. Rachel, he said, using her given name for the first time, I hope you know how much I admire your strength. These past months, watching you rebuild your life while preparing to bring a new one into the world, it's been remarkable. Rachel felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. I couldn't have done it without your help, Xavier. That day at the station, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. You'd have managed, he said with quiet confidence. You're stronger than you know. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Rachel felt the flutter in her heart again, stronger this time. It was too soon. She knew too soon after Thomas, too complicated with the baby coming. And yet, she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. I don't expect anything, Rachel. I just wanted you to know that you've come to mean a great deal to me. Whatever happens, whatever you decide to do after the baby comes, you'll always have a friend in me. The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. Thank you, she whispered. Your friendship has been my anchor these past months. As darkness fell around them, they watched the stars appear one by one in the vast Colorado sky, each lost in their own thoughts about the future and the delicate growing bond between them. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves. Rachel's time grew near, and Mr. Henderson insisted on bringing Mrs. Potter to stay in the main house, ready to assist when the baby decided to make an appearance. That woman raised 6 children of her own, Henderson declared when Rachel protested that it wasn't necessary. And she's helped birth half the calves on this ranch. Between her and Doc Ferguson, you'll be in good hands. Rachel yielded to his concern, secretly grateful for the additional support. Xavier, too, seemed increasingly watchful, finding reasons to check on her throughout the day and ensuring her cabin was well stocked with firewood and supplies. On the evening of September 12th, Rachel was sitting at her small table, writing a letter to her sister, when the first pains struck sharper and more insistent than the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She paused, pen hovering over the page, waiting to see if it would return. When it did, several minutes later, she knew. Setting aside her writing, she rose carefully and put on her shawl. The main house was only a short walk, and she wanted to alert Mrs. Potter before night fell completely. She had barely stepped off her porch when she saw Xavier riding toward her cabin, his figure silhouetted against the sunset. "Rachel," he called, immediately noting her stance. "Is it time?" She nodded, relief washing over her at his timely appearance. "I think so. I was just going to find Mrs. Potter." Xavier was off his horse in an instant, moving to her side. "Let me help you to the house." He offered his arm for support, but as Rachel took a step, another contraction gripped her, stronger than the last. She gasped, clutching his sleeve. Xavier didn't hesitate with gentle efficiency. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the buggy he'd left tied nearby. "Hold on," he said, settling her carefully on the seat before mounting his horse. "I'll ride ahead and bring Mrs. Potter to your cabin. You'll be more comfortable there than trying to move to the main house now." Rachel nodded, unable to speak as another contraction began. Xavier spurred his horse toward the main house, and within minutes he had returned with not only Mrs. Potter, but also one of the ranch hands who had been sent to fetch Dr. Ferguson from town. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Rachel. Mrs. Potter proved invaluable, her calm competence guiding Rachel through the increasing contractions. Dr. Ferguson arrived just as things intensified, bringing his medical bag and reassuring presence. Outside, Xavier paced the length of the small porch, unable to leave despite Mrs. Potter's insistence that men have no place in a birthing room. When Rachel's cries grew louder, he felt each one like a physical blow, wishing desperately he could ease her pain. Just after midnight, a new cry pierced the night, the unmistakable wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Xavier froze mid-pace, his heart pounding as he waited for news. The cabin door opened and Dr. Ferguson stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face broke into a wide smile at the sight of Xavier's anxious expression. "Mother and son are both doing fine," he announced. "A healthy boy, good size too. Mrs. Zimmerman handled it like a champion." "A boy," Xavier repeated, a strange emotion constricting his throat. "May I? Would it be improper to see them?" Dr. Ferguson considered for a moment, then nodded. Just for a moment. She's tired, but asked for you. Xavier removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair before entering the cabin. The scene that greeted him stole his breath. Rachel propped up in bed, her face exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Mrs. Potter was bustling about, cleaning up, but Xavier barely noticed her. His attention was fixed on the new mother and child. "Xavier," Rachel said softly, looking up at him with tired eyes. "Come meet Thomas David Zimmerman." Xavier approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. Rachel tilted the bundle so he could see the tiny face within, red and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, overwhelmed by the tiny life before him and the courage of the woman who had brought him into the world. Rachel smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy and exhaustion. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how I would have managed without you these past months." Xavier could only nod, words failing him at the depth of emotion he felt. Mrs. Potter saved him from having to speak by shooing him toward the door. "That's enough now. Mother and baby need rest, and you can come back tomorrow. Go tell Mr. Henderson he has a new resident on his ranch." As Xavier stepped back into the cool September night, stars blazing overhead, he felt changed somehow. The tiny boy with his mother's courage and his father's name had already claimed a piece of his heart. The weeks following little Thomas's birth brought new rhythms to life at Diamond T Ranch. Rachel recovered her strength gradually, assisted by Mrs. Potter, who insisted on staying in the cabin's small second bedroom. "Just until you've got your legs back under you, dear." Xavier kept a respectful distance during this time, understanding that Rachel needed space to bond with her son and adjust to motherhood. Still, he made his presence known through small kindnesses, fresh eggs delivered to her porch each morning, a rocking chair that appeared one day. Mr. Henderson had it in the attic, said it was Mrs. Henderson's and should be put to use, and occasional brief visits to check on their welfare. Little Thomas thrived, growing plumper by the day. He had his mother's clear blue eyes, and, Rachel sometimes fancied, his father's determined chin. She spent hours simply watching him sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the perfect curve of his ear. When Thomas was a month old, Rachel began taking him for short walks around the ranch property, bundled warmly against the October chill. On one such afternoon, she encountered Xavier repairing a section of fence near her cabin. "Good afternoon," she called, adjusting the blanket around Thomas's sleeping form. "Is it too cold to stop and chat for a moment?" Xavier immediately set down his tools and approached, his face lighting up at the sight of the baby. "Not at all. How are you both today?" "Wonderfully well. Dr. Ferguson says Thomas is growing faster than any baby he's seen in years." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to hold him? You never have, you know." Surprise and something like longing flashed across Xavier's face. "Are you sure?" Rachel nodded, carefully transferring the sleeping infant into Xavier's arms. The cowboy held the baby with unexpected confidence, cradling Thomas's head with one large hand while supporting his body with the other. "You've done this before," Rachel observed. Xavier nodded, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. "My sister's children. I visited Denver often when they were small." He smiled as Thomas yawned in his sleep. "He's a fine boy, Rachel. You should be proud." "I am," she said softly. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "Xavier, I've been thinking about the future. Mr. Henderson has generously offered to let me continue the bookkeeping work, with Thomas beside me. But I've also received a letter from my sister, again inviting me to St. Louis." Xavier's expression remained carefully neutral, but Rachel noticed his arms tightening slightly around the baby. "Have you decided what you'll do?" he asked, his voice controlled. "Not yet," Rachel admitted. "There are considerations I hadn't anticipated when I first arrived in Florissant." Their eyes met, and the unspoken understanding between them hung in the crisp autumn air. So much had changed since that day at the train station, not just Rachel's circumstances, but her heart as well. "Whatever you decide," Xavier said finally, returning Thomas to her arms, "know that you and the boy will always have a place here." The depth of feeling in his voice made it clear he wasn't merely speaking about Henderson's ranch. Rachel nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she continued her walk back to the cabin, she felt Xavier's gaze following them and knew that her decision would shape not just her future and Thomas's, but possibly his as well. That evening, after putting Thomas down in his cradle, Rachel sat at her table with paper and pen, attempting to sort through her thoughts by writing them down. The oil lamp cast a warm glow over the small cabin that had become home in ways she hadn't expected. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reflections. Opening it, she found Xavier standing on the porch, his hat in his hands and an unusually serious expression on his face. "I apologize for the late call," he said formally, "but there's something I need to say, and I fear if I wait until morning, my courage might fail me." Rachel invited him in, curious and somewhat apprehensive. Xavier declined the offered chair, preferring to stand by the fireplace, his tall frame tense with what appeared to be nervous energy. "Rachel," he began, then stopped. Seeming to gather his thoughts, "When we spoke this afternoon about your plans for the future, I realized I've been unfair to you." "Unfair?" Rachel echoed, confused. "You've been nothing but kind and supportive." "That's just it," Xavier said, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I've been careful to keep my feelings to myself, thinking it was the right thing to do while you grieved and adjusted to motherhood. But in doing so, I've left you to make decisions without all the information you might need." Rachel's heart began to beat faster. "What information is that, Xavier?" He took a deep breath, then met her eyes directly. "That I've fallen in love with you, Rachel Zimmerman. It happened slowly, day by day, watching your courage and your kindness. I know it's too soon after your loss, and I know you have Thomas to consider above all else. I don't expect anything from you, not now, perhaps not ever. But before you decide whether to stay in Florissant or go to St. Louis, I wanted you to know that there's a man here who loves you and would be honored to love your son as his own, whenever you might be ready for such a thing." The simple, heartfelt declaration left Rachel speechless. She'd suspected Xavier's feelings, had seen them in his eyes and his actions, but hearing them stated so plainly stirred emotions she'd been trying to understand for weeks. When she didn't immediately respond, Xavier nodded as if her silence was answer enough. "I understand. It's too soon. I just needed you to know before you made your decision." He reached for his hat, preparing to leave. "Xavier, wait." Rachel moved toward him, her mind racing to catch up with her heart. "You're right that it's been a tumultuous time. I lost Thomas, gained a son, and found a new home all in the span of a few months. I've barely had time to sort through my feelings." She took another step closer, close enough now to see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "But I do know this. The thought of leaving Diamond T, of leaving you, brings me more sorrow than I can express. I'm not ready to put words to what I feel, but I'm not ready to say goodbye either." Hope dawned in Xavier's expression. "What are you saying, Rachel?" "I'm saying I'd like more time. Time to get to know you better. Time to see if what I'm feeling might grow into something as strong and sure as what you've expressed." She smiled softly. "Time for you and Thomas to know each other, too." Xavier's face transformed with joy. "Time is something I have plenty of, Rachel. And patience, too, when something's worth waiting for." Impulsively, Rachel reached for his hand, her smaller one fitting perfectly within his weathered palm. "Then let's agree no hasty decisions. I'll write to my sister and explain that we're staying in Florissant, at least for now. The future can reveal itself in its own time." Xavier nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "May I call on you properly? Sunday dinners, perhaps, or rides around the ranch when the weather permits?" "I'd like that very much," Rachel replied, surprised by how right it felt, how natural, despite the lingering grief she carried for Thomas. Perhaps the heart was capable of more than she had imagined, able to honor the past while still opening to new possibilities. As Xavier left that night, the autumn stars brilliant above, Rachel felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her life had taken an unexpected turn that day at the train station, but standing now in the doorway of her cabin, watching Xavier walk toward his horse, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The Colorado winter arrived with a suddenness that took Rachel's breath away. One day the ranch was bathed in the golden light of late autumn, and the next it was transformed into a white wonderland as the first major snowstorm swept through the valley. Thomas, now 3 months old and growing more alert by the day, seemed fascinated by the snow falling outside the cabin window. Rachel would hold him up to watch the flakes swirl and dance, his tiny face alight with wonder. Life at Diamond Tea settled into a comfortable winter routine. Rachel resumed her bookkeeping duties, bringing Thomas with her to the main house each day. Mr. Henderson proved to be besotted with the baby, often abandoning important ranch business to make silly faces at the little cowpoke. Xavier called on Rachel each Sunday as promised, sometimes taking her and Thomas for short sleigh rides around the ranch, bundled in warm blankets against the cold. Other times they would simply sit by the fire in her cabin, talking and watching Thomas play on a quilt spread before the hearth. Their relationship grew naturally, building on the foundation of friendship and respect that had formed over the previous months. Xavier never pushed for more than Rachel was ready to give, content with the slow blossoming of their connection. Rachel found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both excited and frightened her. She still wore her wedding ring, still spoke to Thomas of his father, but increasingly her thoughts of the future included Xavier's steady presence. Christmas at Diamond Tea was a joyous occasion. Mr. Henderson insisted that all the ranch hands and their families gather at the main house for a feast that Mrs. Potter spent days preparing. The great room was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a massive tree cut from the ranch property dominated one corner, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. Rachel dressed Thomas in a tiny suit that Mrs. Potter had sewn specially for the occasion. She herself wore her best dress, a deep green wool that Xavier had admired once when she wore it to Sunday services in town. When Xavier arrived to escort them to the main house, his appreciative gaze confirmed she'd chosen well. He himself looked handsome in clean dark trousers and a pressed shirt, his usual weathered hat replaced by one that looked nearly new. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her his arm. The evening was filled with good food, music played on a fiddle by one of the ranch hands, and the warm camaraderie of people who worked hard together and celebrated with equal enthusiasm. Thomas was passed from admirer to admirer, seemingly enjoying the attention, though Rachel kept a watchful eye to ensure he wasn't overwhelmed. Later, as the celebration continued, Xavier drew Rachel aside and led her to the relative quiet of Henderson's study. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "For Christmas." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Rachel unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Xavier, it's beautiful," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty. "I thought perhaps you might want to put a small photograph inside," Xavier explained. "Of Thomas, or," he hesitated, "of his father, if you have one." The thoughtfulness of the gift, acknowledging both her present joy and her past loss, moved Rachel deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, impulsively rising on tiptoe to place a soft kiss on his cheek. Xavier's eyes darkened with emotion, and for a moment Rachel thought he might kiss her properly. Instead, he gently took the locket from her hands and moved behind her to fasten it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. "Merry Christmas, Rachel," he murmured close to her ear. As they rejoined the party, the locket warm against her collarbone, Rachel felt something shift inside her, a readiness to embrace the future that was taking shape before her, even as she honored the past she carried in her heart. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted from the valley, though it remained on the distant peaks, and the ranch came alive with the sounds of new calves and the bright green of fresh grass. Thomas, now 7 months old, was sitting up on his own and attempting to crawl, much to his mother's alternating delight and dismay. One mild April afternoon, Xavier appeared at the main house where Rachel was working on the quarterly accounts. Thomas was napping in a basket beside her desk, his dark lashes fanned against his chubby cheeks. "Beautiful day," Xavier observed, leaning against the doorframe. "Too nice to be inside with ledgers." Rachel smiled, setting down her pen. "Are you suggesting I neglect my duties, Mr. Thornton?" "Absolutely," he replied with a grin. "Mr. Henderson rode into town for supplies. He'll never know you abandoned his precious books for an hour or two." The temptation was too great to resist. Rachel checked on Thomas, who was sleeping soundly, then accepted Xavier's offered hand. "Where are we going?" she asked as he led her outside to where 2 horses waited. "Not far," Xavier assured her. "Mrs. Potter is watching for Thomas to wake. She'll send someone to fetch us if he needs you." They rode at an easy pace through meadows now dotted with early wildflowers. Xavier led her to a small rise overlooking the valley, where the entire Diamond T spread out before them, the buildings small in the distance. "I've been meaning to show you this view," Xavier said as they dismounted. "In spring, it's particularly fine." Rachel had to agree. The mountains formed a magnificent backdrop to the verdant valley, and from this vantage point, she could see the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the ranch property. "It's lovely," she said, breathing deeply of the clean mountain air. Xavier seemed unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Rachel studied his profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the tiny crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled. "Is something on your mind?" she asked gently. Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious. "Yes, actually. Something I've been considering for some time." Rachel's heart quickened at his tone. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened into something neither had put a name to, but which both recognized as precious and increasingly essential to their happiness. "Rachel," Xavier began, taking her hands in his, "these past 9 months have been the most meaningful of my life. Watching you with Thomas, seeing your strength and your kindness, I've come to love you more than I thought possible." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I know you still carry Thomas's father in your heart, and I would never ask you to set aside those memories, but I hope there might be room in your life in your future for me as well." Rachel's eyes filled with tears as Xavier slowly knelt before her, still holding her hands in his. "Rachel Zimmerman, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I promise to cherish you and Thomas for all my days, to be a good father to him and a faithful husband to you." Time seemed to stand still as Rachel looked down at this man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness that day at the train station. She thought of Thomas, her husband, who would always hold a place in her heart, and of little Thomas, who deserved a father's love and guidance. And she thought of Xavier, whose steady presence had become as essential to her as breathing, whose love had helped heal her wounded heart and given her the courage to imagine a future different than the one she had planned. "Yes," she whispered, her voice growing stronger as certainty filled her. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." Joy transformed his features as he rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he lowered his mouth to hers in their first kiss, gentle at first, then deepening as Rachel responded with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted with a smile that made her heart race. "I'm glad you waited," Rachel replied honestly. "I needed time to be sure, to know that my heart was free to love again without betraying what I had with Thomas." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now? Now I know that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for him. It's different, but just as real and just as true." She reached up to touch his cheek. "Thomas gave me the past and little Thomas. You're giving me a future. I'm grateful for both." They stood together on the hilltop, the spring breeze surrounding them with the scent of new beginnings, planning the life they would build together. Rachel and Xavier were married on a perfect June day, almost exactly a year after they had first met at the Florissant train station. The ceremony was held in the meadow of wildflowers Xavier had shown her that first summer, now in full glorious bloom. Little Thomas, now 10 months old and recently mastering the art of walking if someone held his hands, was carried down the makeshift aisle by Mr. Henderson, who had insisted on giving the bride away. "Ain't got no children of my own," the old rancher had declared gruffly when Rachel tearfully accepted his offer. "Consider it a privilege." The bride wore a simple dress of ivory silk ordered from Denver, with the silver locket Xavier had given her at Christmas gleaming at her throat. Inside it now were 2 tiny photographs, one of her first husband Thomas, cut from a larger portrait, and one of little Thomas taken by a traveling photographer who had passed through Florissant in the spring. Xavier waited beneath an arch of flowers constructed by the ranch hands, looking handsome and somewhat nervous in a new suit. When Rachel appeared at the end of the flower-strewn path, his face lit with a joy so pure it brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened cowboys present. The pastor from Florissant's small church performed the ceremony, his words about new beginnings and God's providence in bringing hearts together seeming particularly appropriate to the occasion. When it came time for the vows, Xavier surprised Rachel by having memorized his own, speaking from the heart rather than repeating the pastor's traditional words. "Rachel," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "on a day much like this one, I found you alone and afraid. In helping you, I found myself and the purpose I'd been seeking without knowing it. I promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to be a father to Thomas and any other children we might be blessed with, to honor the past you bring with you while building our future together. This is my solemn vow." Rachel, too moved to speak for a moment, finally responded with her own promises to love him faithfully, to build a home and family with him, to face life's joys and sorrows together as partners and friends. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was tender, but held a promise of passion that brought a blush to Rachel's cheeks and a few good-natured whoops from the assembled ranch hands. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with tables set up near the meadow, lanterns hanging from tree branches, and enough food to feed twice the number present. There was dancing to fiddle music, speeches both heartfelt and humorous, and moments when Rachel found herself pausing in wonder at how completely her life had transformed in the space of a year. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" Xavier asked, finding her at the edge of the celebration, watching as little Thomas was passed around and cooed over by the women present. "Very," Rachel replied, leaning into his embrace, "though the name will take some getting used to." "We have time," Xavier murmured against her hair. "A lifetime." As the stars appeared overhead, Rachel thought of that day at the station, how lost she had felt, how uncertain of the future. She could never have imagined then that the handsome cowboy tipping his hat and offering assistance would become her husband, that she would find a home and a new love in this beautiful Colorado Valley. Life's path was unpredictable, she reflected. But sometimes its unexpected turns led to destinations more wonderful than any that could have been planned. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window of the ranch house kitchen, where Rachel was putting the finishing touches on a birthday cake. Through the window, she could see Xavier in the yard, 5-year-old Thomas on his shoulders, while 3-year-old Catherine and 2-year-old Jack clamored for their turns. "Papa, higher!" Thomas called. His dark hair, so like his father's, had been ruffled by the summer breeze. Rachel smiled, watching as Xavier pretended to nearly drop the boy, causing shrieks of delight from all 3 children. Her husband caught her eye through the window and grinned, that same heart-stopping smile that still made her pulse quicken after all these years. So much had changed since their wedding day. With Mr. Henderson's blessing and financial backing, Xavier had purchased a neighboring property when it came up for sale 2 years ago. The old rancher, now approaching 80 but still sharp as a tack, had declared it was high time the Diamond T had some new blood in the ownership. The Henderson Thornton Ranch, as it was now known, had prospered under their joint management. Xavier handled the cattle operations, while Rachel kept the books and correspondence, a partnership that extended seamlessly from their personal life to their business. Their family had grown as well. Catherine Rose had arrived 11 months after the wedding, a tiny, feisty girl with her mother's blue eyes and her father's determined nature. Jack Henderson Thornton had followed less than 2 years later. Named for the old rancher who had become like a grandfather to them all. Now, as Rachel carried the cake decorated with 5 carefully crafted candles out to the porch, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Her life was full in ways she could never have imagined that day at the Florissant train station. "Cake time!" she called, and was immediately surrounded by excited children, Xavier following at a more sedate pace with Thomas still perched on his shoulders. "Ready to make a wish, birthday boy?" Xavier asked, lifting Thomas down and smoothing his hair. The 5-year-old nodded solemnly, his blue eyes so like his mother's fixed on the flickering candles. Rachel knelt beside him, her arm around his small shoulders. "What are you going to wish for, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Thomas looked up at her, then at Xavier, who now stood on his other side, then at his younger siblings, who watched with undisguised envy as he prepared for this moment of glory. "Nothing," he said decisively. "I already got everything." Xavier's eyes met Rachel's over their son's head, a world of shared feeling passing between them. They both knew what the boy meant in his simple, profound way. This family, this home, this life they had built together, it was everything. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep, exhausted from a day of celebration, Xavier and Rachel sat on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the velvet sky. "He's right, you know," Xavier said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "That boy of ours, we do have everything." Rachel nodded, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd gotten on that train, if you hadn't been at the station that day." Xavier's arm tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was running late on my errands and happened to be there just when you needed someone." Rachel smiled, remembering. "You tipped your hat and said, 'You're not alone anymore.' I didn't believe you then." "And now?" Xavier asked, tilting her face up to his. "Now I know it was the truest thing anyone has ever said to me." Rachel's voice was soft in the gathering darkness. "I love you, Xavier Thornton, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." As his lips found hers in a kiss still filled with the passion of new love and the depth of years shared. Rachel knew that sometimes life's most difficult moments, a widow alone and pregnant at a train station, could lead to its greatest joys. All it took was courage, time, and sometimes the kindness of a cowboy who tipped his hat and changed everything.